Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, IDIS in 90 Minutes, Common Mistakes Grantees Make in Reporting CDBG Data. Today's call will last approximately 90 minutes. All callers are muted due to the high number of participants. The webinar will be recorded for future use and made available for viewing and downloading. The presenter for today is
Bill Kubel.
If you are having audio difficulties, try using your telephone for audio instead of computer speakers. If you have questions, you are welcome to submit them through the presentation using the questions function on the GoToWebinar toolbar. Submit your questions by keying them in the text box under the questions pane on the toolbar. The presenter will answer some questions during the webinar. Others will be answered in a new FAQ document posted to the website www.concon.org.
Okay, well, good morning, good afternoon to all of you out in IDIS land. Today we're going to talk about a very important topic and hopefully save you some time and heartache when you enter the data into IDIS. We're going to talk about common mistakes that you make when reporting and also during setup of entering data into IDIS. This is a short version of our agenda. We want to encourage you to get your questions in as well. So if there's some problems that you're facing when entering the data in IDIS and we don't cover it, go ahead and definitely use that question ask feature of the webinar to submit those questions. As Amber said, we are not going to be able to get to all of your questions today. We, I think, have about upwards of 700 people registered for today's webinar. But if I don't get to your question, as she said, we'll try to post some answers to the FAQ, and we'll try to also respond via email where we can. So today we're specifically going to talk about common mistakes made during setting up the activity, including using incorrect matrix codes, using not providing enough location and address information. On the accomplishment side, we want to make sure that you're reporting in the correct year. Some people are still reporting in the incorrect program year. We'll talk about how to address that. Some grantees are reporting the same beneficiary multiple times. We want to make sure that that's limited. And some grantees are not providing enough information. They're not providing all the data and fields that do apply to the activity in question. We'll also spend a little time on program income. And again, we should have plenty of time at the end for questions and answers. We'll try to address as many as possible while we are online here. But again, if we can't get to your question, please be patient and we'll try to address it either directly via email or through the FAQ. So why is the information in IDIS so important? Number one, the system is going to help us demonstrate compliance. Not only to you and the grantee to HUD, but also demonstrating compliance to all the other decision makers and information gatherers out there. It provides transparency and accountability. So especially in these tough budget times, when people are looking to take a budget axe to different programs, it's very important to show that these funds are being used in the correct manner and they're really going out there and benefiting the community, as especially the low-income folks in those communities. It's important to respond to frequent requests from the White House, OMB, Congress, GAO, OIG, the HUD Secretary, and IDIS is the one tool that the good folks in the CDBG office have to really demonstrate the power and the ability for CDBG to make improvements in these communities. Okay. Let me just move this chat box here. So demonstrate the contributions that each one of the grantees, all of you out there, are making towards meeting the needs of the low and moderate income citizens in your community. And that's the whole point behind CDBG. And again, IDIS is the one tool that HUD has that's able to quickly gather this information really and demonstrate that there is these outcomes are being met in the community. Oops. Okay. Before we get started, a lot of folks in the last two webinars have asked where they can get their hands on these slides. The slides are available at this website here. There's also the training materials there. Let me just click on that real quick. I want to show you all the different resources available to you. In addition to today's webinar, and we also have one tomorrow, which will cover generating reports in IDIS, we have two webinars that we did last week, and they have recordings. We have videos of those webinars and the slides posted to this website. For today's webinars, if you go to this ComCon website, which is www.comcon.org/program/idis.html, you should see a PDF where you can download today's slides, and if you happen to join us tomorrow, tomorrow's slides as well. Okay, so there's a couple other resources that we will be adding to this website. Already posted are all of the training materials from the live sessions we've done over the last year. And in addition, we will also be posting basically a video version of the live trainings that some of you may have attended, where basically you can go in and watch the entire training, the entire two-day training online, and download all the materials. So we're really excited about that. It will probably be up, well, it will definitely be up by the end of September. So please watch for that. That will also be posted to this website. Okay, so common mistakes made when setting up your information, when entering your information at the very beginning of the year. One of the most important things you need to do at the beginning of the year is to select the right matrix code for each activity that you want to fund and report on. So the matrix code, it describes the eligibility of the activity. It shows how that activity is eligible under the CDBG regulations. One of the most common problems out there is grantees use a common matrix code such as 03 and 05. So 03 is Public Facilities General and 05 is Public Services General. Let me jump into the system really quick. I'm still logged in here. So this is the first page of activity setup, and I'm talking about this field right here, the activity category. It's called activity category in the system, but we all know it as the matrix codes, correct? So if I look at this big long list, I see all these very specific codes for 03, 03A for senior center, 03B for handicapped, 03C for homeless facility. You want to use these very specific codes here instead of using 03 public facilities general. Okay, so you only want to use 03 as a last resort if none of those other more specific codes does not fit. Same thing for public services. We see an 05 general for public services, but then we have these very specific codes about senior services, handicapped services, legal services, and so on. So HUD wants you to use the most specific code possible and only use 05 as a last resort for your public services if they don't fit anywhere else in that. So you can see also for some of you folks, they have added some new matrix codes. So they have been updating this list as HUD sees the need. For example, a lot of people didn't know where to put housing counseling, so they added an 05U code. Okay, if you need help on choosing the most specific and most appropriate matrix code, what you want to do is use Appendix A of the online training manual. Okay, Appendix A is going to list all of the different matrix codes. It will give you a short description of each, and it will also provide you some guidance as to when to use each matrix code. Should I use 01 for acquisition, for example, or should I use 14 in the 14 series if I'm also doing rehab? So use that appendix, and it will be a tremendous help in choosing the right matrix code. One example of where grantees get confused is misusing 05U for, I'm sorry, using 13 or 05R, which are basically down payment assistance codes, when they're using that for housing counseling. Okay, so you only want to use 13 or 05R, which again are down payment assistance codes, when you're actually providing financial assistance as part of that activity. If you're just providing counseling, you have to use 05U, which is a public service matrix code. Anytime you use 05U, it's going to count towards your public service cap. But if you're only providing counseling, that's the correct code to use. So if you are only providing counseling, you would use 05U and report the number of persons receiving counseling. If you are also providing financial assistance, you have a choice between 13 and 05R. 05, again, you see that's an 05, so it's going to be in the public services cap. Most people, I would say 99% of the people out there who do provide financial assistance for down payment are going to use 13. Okay? If you do provide financial assistance, you're going to use one of those two codes, and you're going to report the number of persons receiving financial assistance as the actual outcome. There's also an additional performance measure you'll see where you can report the number of people who also received housing counseling. But one of the issues here was, you may help hundreds and hundreds of people with housing counseling, and that was inflating the numbers, and it wasn't it was skewing the numbers in terms of the number of people who actually received financial assistance. So again, this is one example of a common mistake grantees are using. So make sure you use the correct matrix code when you're funding housing counseling. One final note on that is if you provide both financial assistance and housing counseling is a component of that. For example, everybody who receives financial assistance, they also have to receive counseling. That can be rolled into the activity that is coded as 13 or 05R. You just have to make sure that you are also providing financial assistance and you're reporting on the people who receive the financial assistance, not the housing counseling. Okay, another common issue that grantees are having are when they use CDBG for housing acquisition. There's two matrix codes that you can use, 01 and 14G. And there's a problem that grantees are basically closing out these activities too early. They're using the CDBG funds to acquire the land, but they don't wait until they have the housing built or rehabbed and people in there. Basically, they don't have the beneficiary data, and they're closing it out without the beneficiary data. So HUD has come out and said it's okay to use CDBG to acquire this land and leave that activity open until you have the beneficiary data. So it may be open 1, 2, even 3 or 4 years until you get that beneficiary data, until you get all those units leased up or occupied. So what you're going to do in these cases are you're going to leave the activity open. You're not going to report any numeric beneficiaries per se, but you'll use that narrative, that accomplishment narrative in the system to explain to your HUD representative where you are in the overall process. Okay, so again, if you're using CDBG for the acquisition of housing and that housing, it's not done in that first year, that's fine. You just have to use that narrative to explain why that activity is still open, and again, keep it open until you have all the beneficiaries for all of the assisted units. Okay. One of the other issues that grantees are struggling with is providing enough location and address information. I'm going to switch back to IDIS so I can show you where that's at. Here we are back at this activity. We're going to click on Edit under Setup Detail, and it will be on the first page. This is pretty standard. It's going to be the same for all your CDBG activities. I'm just using a housing rehab activity because I want to show you a specific feature for this. And here's the address section right here. Now, depending on the type of activity you're doing, you may or may not be able to provide a specific address. In this case, my activity represents a housing rehab for one property, so I could put in the property address of that one activity, of that housing unit. If you don't have a specific address, let's say you're doing street improvements, for example, the correct thing to do would be to put in a description of what area is being served. Perhaps you could say we are rehabbing the 500 to 600 block of of Main Street. So it may look something like this, 500 block of Main Street. What HUD doesn't want here is they would not want the address of the Public Works Department that's actually doing the work. They're really not interested in the administrative address of the organization carrying out the activity. What they want to know is where in the community, what sections of the community are benefiting from the CDBG funds. They're going to be able to take this information and map it and use it as one more kind of tool to show, yes, these CDBG funds are going to the needy areas and the areas that need improvement in your community. A couple other features is, this is somewhat relatively new, but every time you add the address, it's going to say validate this address. So if you click on that, the system may or may not be able to find that address. In this case, you can see that the system actually switched it out just to 500 Main Street, and that's fine. And it will actually allow us to go ahead and map that address and pull up some demographic data about that address in that area. Sometimes you're not able to find an address, let's say scattered site. I just want to pull up something that I know is not going to be able to geocode. Okay, so if it can't find your address, that's fine. Again, you want to try to provide something as specific as possible so HUD can map it anytime it's feasible. But in some cases, it's going to come back with no matching address was found. So just double check that you entered it correctly. If you did and it still can't find it, what you want to do is check this box down here, skip validation for now. Okay, so one other thing I'd like to bring up is this newest feature. I believe it was added in June or July of this year, is this add, edit additional locations. So a lot of grantees out there, they were setting up one activity for single-family rehab. And because they were doing that, HUD was not able to match or map, I should say, each address that the grantees were serving. So in that case, you know, they were really losing a lot of that ability to map the data. Okay, so what they did is they said you can set up one activity to represent your entire single-family rehab program. But what you want to do is you want to use this feature, the add, edit additional locations, and you're going to add a separate address for each rehab that you complete. Okay? So again, HUD is really looking for that data so they can demonstrate that these funds are going and where these funds are going in your community. Okay, so let me switch back to the slide and make sure I didn't miss anything. Okay. HUD encourages the use of multiple activities to report on multiple sites. So for example, if you are rehabbing 3 different public facilities, you would want to set up 3 different activities, and that way you could enter a separate address for each one of those facilities. It may actually make more sense to you as well, because it's possible that each one of those activities would be using a different contractor, and you could use the system to measure the progress of each one of those specific addresses. Okay. Again, we talked about infrastructure activities. If you're doing street improvements, you can use an address range to say, I'm going from the 500 block to the 700 block of Main Street. Again, HUD is not looking for the address of the administrative office of the organization carrying out the activity. They want to find out where in the community, what sections of the community are benefiting. Okay. Again, we talked about address verification and the new multiple address feature. I see that some people have posted some questions here. Number 1, should I create a separate IDIS activity for each year of a multi-year funded capital improvement activity, or should I keep the same IDIS number and increase the funding amount? Which is the best way? Please let me know. You know, you do have some options there. In this case, I would probably, my personal preference, and you know, you might look at the FAQ later on to see if we provide a little bit more guidance once I've talked this through with HUD. But in my preference, I think it's cleaner if you just set up one activity in the first year and then increase the funding for that activity in subsequent years if it's funded in subsequent action plans. You can also set up multiple activities representing that same scope of work. If you do that, what you would want to do is, let me switch back here, is use this section right here, associate to another activity, and just report the accomplishments once under one of the activities, and that way you wouldn't be double counting. So that's a very good question. Again, I might get a little bit more clarification from HUD. We might check at the FAQ later on that we post to the website for further guidance. In my case, when I was setting up information for grantees, I would set that up once and then just increase the funding each time it got more money. So good question. Keep it coming. I'm going to read some more of these questions as they come in. Okay. A second mistake that grantees have made, and a place where the work is getting done, but the program just and the grantees are not getting credit for the work, is under leveraging. So among the different people monitoring the performance of the CDBG program, there's they're very interested in its ability to leverage other dollars and other funding sources. And the IDIS is going to be one of those tools to demonstrate CDBG's ability to do this. So we want to go ahead and look at the section of the system. It's under Setup Detail. So right now I'm on page 1 of Setup Detail. If I hit Save and Continue, it didn't like it that I didn't click that validation. So this is a good example of, so you can see my error message up here, no matching address was found. Check the address and validate it again. Or I can choose to validate later. I'll do that. I will validate later and move to the second page. So here I am on Setup Detail page 2, and I have this section right here on, basically it doesn't say leveraging, but it's basically the budget, right? It's where you're entering the data from other funding sources. One common mistake grantees make is they try to input the amount of CDBG funding somewhere. You'll notice that the first line for CDBG is actually grayed out. That means the system's going to provide that field for us. So we don't need to put anything in there necessarily. What we do need to do, though, is provide information in these other fields. You'll notice that these fields are not required. The system is not requiring you to put anything in this system or into these fields. And the problem with that, well, let me start over. The reason they do that is because theoretically an activity could be fully funded out of CDBG. In reality, however, that's not always the case. A lot of these public facility projects and a lot of the economic development and even a lot of the public services, they have other funding that are contributing to these projects. And since it's not a required field, a lot of grantees just get past this. But this is the one good opportunity to use IDIS to show all of these folks all of the other funds that CDBG is able to leverage. Once you do provide that information and once you draw the money against that activity, what the system will do is it's going to calculate a leveraging ratio down here. So it will say for every $1 of CDBG and 108 spent, 108 is Section 108, which is a portion of the CDBG program. For every $1 of CDBG and 108, we were able to leverage this much in other funding. So again, it's something that's not required by the system, but it's very helpful, and it's going to, basically you're not completely reporting on the activity if you leave this section blank. HUD has stated, especially since it's in the setup detail part, if you have some estimates at the beginning of the year where maybe that activity's budget isn't fully fleshed out, you just have an idea of what these fields are, go ahead and use the estimates. The estimates are better than nothing. And then during the completion of the activity, when you're actually reporting on accomplishments, you can come back and update this information. Okay, let me just look through the question log real quick. Okay, and let's again, if you have any additional questions on specific sections that I'm going over, go ahead and note that in your question, and I'll come back to it. But one problem that grantees have made here is they've entered data into the wrong section, and that's the note here, accurate. So some grantees in California, Michigan, and Montana, they were entering amounts in the ARC, which is the Appalachian Regional Commission. Obviously, those states aren't part of the Appalachian region, and so HUD had questions about why those grantees were entering amounts in this field. I know HUD has had similar issues with grantees entering information in the Section 108 field when they, in fact, don't receive Section 108 funds. So again, just try to be accurate, try to be concise and specific in terms of using which funds you are reporting on. Okay, so that's set up. Again, we want to focus on three things. We want to be accurate, we want to be timely, and we want to be complete when reporting on our accomplishments. And that affects your setup as well. If you have a good setup, it's going to make reporting accomplishments in IDIS easier. So in terms of when to report, HUD would like you to report on a quarterly basis. That's the recommended. And that's going to do a number of things for you. Number one is if you have a large amount of data you need to enter into IDIS throughout the year, hopefully it will take off some of that pressure to enter all of the data at the end of the year. So if you can complete activities throughout the program year, if you can provide the beneficiary data throughout the program year, you'll just have less of it to do at the end of the year. Makes sense, right? It will also help as a monitoring function if you're getting and collecting a lot of information from subrecipients and they are not collecting the right type or they're underreporting data and you have to enter it into the system. It serves as a check to make sure that they are in fact collecting all of the data that you need to be feeding into the system. So if you do that on a quarterly basis, you may catch the mistake at the end of the first quarter instead of at the end of the year where you would have to go back and try to backtrack and collect a lot of data that you may not be able to get. So that's why quarterly reporting is recommended. However, it's not required. You do have to get the information into the system by the end of the year, by the end of your CAPER submission time. So once your program year closes, you have 90 days to submit your CAPER. You should have all of the information, all of the accomplishments that you received or that you realized for that program year. You should have the information in IDIS in time to submit your CAPER, which again is due 90 days after the close of your program year. So that's in terms of when to report. That's what we're looking at. In terms of what to report, we want to report on the benefits realized during the program year. So even if it's a 2005 activity, but they created 10 jobs in 2010, you need to make sure that those 10 jobs are reported under 2010 as opposed to 2005. What we're going to see is if you reported them as a 2005 benefit because it was first funded in 2005, you're never going to get credit for those jobs, and HUD is never going to get credit for those jobs. HUD is really focused on the last program year to be completed. So we'll go in the system and take a look at that. The second bullet point there, report on every screen, completeness. Again, this is just like on leveraging, where the field may not necessarily be required by the system, but it does in fact apply to the activity you're undertaking. So if it applies to the activity you're undertaking, you need to provide information for that activity. We're also using IDIS to report on, whoops, sorry about that, folks. We are using IDIS to report on complying with specific national objectives. That's one of the major functions of this tool of IDIS, to show that HUD that your funded activities are meeting national objectives. In addition to meeting the national objectives, HUD collects additional accomplishment and performance measurements, and that's going to help flesh out the story that we're telling about the benefits in your community. It's really important to understand the type of data that's collected, and to do that at the beginning of the year. Again, we want to make sure that your paperwork and the QPRs you're providing to your subrecipients, they do in fact collect all the necessary information we need to feed into IDIS. So one tool that's really helpful in this regard is that training manual. The training manual is just full of screenshots of the information that you're going to need to collect. So if you don't know what information you need to collect, for example, for economic development or public facility, go into the manual, look at all the different performance measures the system is asking you to report on, and make sure that your your paper management system, your file, is able to collect that data. Okay, so one of the common mistakes grantees make is they report accomplishments in the incorrect program year. So again, activities can be set up under multiple program years. I'm going to go back into the system to demonstrate this feature. So I'm back at my single-family rehab activity. I'm actually going to switch to a multifamily activity. Or maybe even, let's do economic development, because that's a common time where you have an activity open for more than 1 year. So this activity, economic development loan to Thompson Automotive, this is a loan to a specific business where they're going to create jobs over multiple years. Right-click on Edit. And here's the first screen. I want to go under the accomplishment data. Okay, so let's assume this activity, it was first funded in 2011. You can see that up here. I set it up as a 2011 activity, but I have the opportunity to add a new accomplishment year. And you can see I actually already did that for 2012. Once you add more than one program year, you'll see those years provided for right here. So again, if I look at 2011, you can see I reported on a total of 3 jobs or 3 persons assisted in 2011. And that's important because HUD's going to take that information and include that in basically giving you credit for 2011 and showing the number of jobs created by the CDBG program as a whole in 2011. Now, if this activity was still creating jobs in 2012, I wouldn't want to just come in here and wipe this out and maybe say 3 jobs created in 2011, and then, oh, look, I have more space, so I'm just going to say 2 jobs created in 2012. And then I would go ahead and complete these sections as well. That's what not to do. That would be a mistake because, again, when HUD is looking for 2012 data, when they're looking at your 2012 CAPER, and when HUD's rolling up this data into the national data sets for 2012, they're not going to be looking at this field here. They're not going to be looking for 2011. I need to report that information under 2012. Okay? So anytime you have an activity that's open for more than one program year, you have to make sure that you're giving yourself credit by using the right program year. Okay? If that drop-down wasn't there, let's say this activity extended into 2013, again, I don't see 2013 here, so I would come up here to the Add New Accomplishment Year, and what that does is it gives me 2 more sets of screens, both this screen and the next, and I can put all of my accomplishments for 2013 on these pages, and that way I'll make sure that I get credit for those jobs. It's a common mistake. So a lot of grantees say, this was funded in 2006, I'm going to report it as 2006 accomplishment, but again, you're not going to get credit and HUD's not going to get credit. Just on a related note, the system also now has a section under Setup. I'm just going to switch back to the first page and show you under Setup, where you can do a similar thing for proposed accomplishments. So not only can you report accomplishments over multiple years, you can actually, under Setup Detail, so now I'm on Setup Detail page 1, you can also, divvy up your proposed accomplishment. So let's say according to this loan to this specific business, they said, well, we think we're going to be able to create 3 jobs in 2011, 2 additional jobs in 2012, and maybe 1 more job in 2013. You can see that the system, I have this button here, Add Another Year. The system allows me to go ahead and break out those proposed goals over multiple years as well. Okay, so that's a nice feature because in a lot of cases, you may have a public facilities activity where you don't think the benefit is going to happen in this first year. And so this is allowing you to better communicate to HUD when you think those benefits and when those accomplishments are going to come online. Okay? Okay. There are cases HUD is, I'll talk about a couple different cleanup efforts that HUD is undertaking, but one is HUD looks for cases where funds are spent but no units are reported. In order to basically explain that, that's where you would want to use that narrative section of the system. Again, it's okay where if you spend the money in one year and the benefits aren't realized into the next, as long as you eventually get the benefits in there and you use that narrative of the system to explain where you are in that program. So maybe I spent all the CDBG funds on acquisition of that house, but it's not built yet or it's not rehabbed yet and we don't have people living in that house. I'm going to use the narrative to explain that section. Okay, so let's move on. Another common mistake grantees make is to report the same accomplishment multiple times. And there's a couple different ways to do that. Number one is reporting the same unit in more than one program year. Okay, so that jobs project or activity is a good example. So if I said, well, overall I'm going to create 6 jobs. In the first year I reported 3, and then the second year I reported 5, which would be the 2 and the 3. In the third year I reported 6. You can see I'm double counting. I reported these 3 jobs not once, not twice, but 3 times. Okay, so across program years, only count that job the first time it's created. And the same thing for housing units. If you happen to have a housing unit that's rehabbed, it started its rehab in one year, but it wasn't finished to the next year, only count that housing unit once when it's actually complete. It's going to be very difficult for some of you to avoid double counting people. So let's say you did a soup kitchen, for example. You're not going to be able to, get an unduplicated count of the number of people you serve just because the nature of the activity. You're probably going to say, I served 100 people today, and you're not going to be able to tell whether it's the same 100 people who show up tomorrow. So it's not such a crime to duplicate people. What HUD is very, very interested in and thinks you can control is being able to report unduplicated counts for housing units, public facilities, and jobs, and businesses assisted. So in those cases, you should be able to very clearly say yes and just report once each one of those factors once. Okay. There's also a possibility of reporting on the same unit under more than one activity, and this happens when you use a separate activity to track program delivery costs. And in the type of question we had earlier, when you set up more than one activity to represent the same scope of work. So let's say you are funding a street improvements project, and you funded it, maybe you funded the pre-development in 2009 and funded some of the construction in 2010. In addition, you funded additional construction in 2011. If you set up 3 separate activities for that same scope of work, you really only want to report beneficiaries once under one of those 3 activities, and you would use that reported under another activity flag. Right here, you would use this to ensure you only report the beneficiaries under one of those 3 activities. Okay. Same thing for program delivery. If you have a separate activity for program delivery of your housing rehab program or your economic development program, you'll have other activities to report on the hard costs, and you're going to report the beneficiaries under the hard cost activities. And for your program delivery activities, you don't want to report accomplishments, otherwise you'd be double counting your accomplishments. So you'd answer yes to this question, and you could put in the activity ID of just one. HUD doesn't need all of them. If you want to report on all of the activity IDs that the program delivery helped with, you can put that in the narrative. HUD just wants to know one of the other activities that the program delivery helped deliver, for lack of a better word. So again, when you do have an activity that, or multiple activities that represent the same scope of work, this field will be helpful to you. And when you have activities that just represent the program delivery costs, and the hard costs and accomplishments will be reported elsewhere, again, that's another time where you can use this feature of the system. And again, this is on Setup Detail page 1 of IDIS. Okay, it's on this page, right when you first set up the activity. Okay. There are cases where people get confused, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit, where maybe CDBG is just paying for program delivery and using other funding sources such as home to pay for the hard cost of the project. And in those cases, you actually want to report the accomplishments under the program delivery activity. We'll get into that in just a couple slides. Maybe it's the next one. We'll see. Oh, here we go. Good segue. Okay, so there are two of the matrix codes available to you. One is Housing Rehab Administration, and that's 14H. That's the matrix code. 14J is Housing Services. Okay, so there are a couple different scenarios where you use these codes, and based on the scenario, will determine whether you report on accomplishments under that program delivery activity. Okay, so in the first scenario, let's say you set up a separate activity in IDIS using code 14H to represent the program delivery costs of your housing rehab activity, or your housing rehab program, I should say. Okay, so if you have other activities in IDIS that are reporting on the hard costs and the accomplishments of that housing rehab program, then you'd want to say yes to that question. You're going to answer yes to this question right here. Say yes, all of my activity accomplishments will be reported under the other CDBG funded activities in the system. And again, HUD just wants one ID, one of those other IDs. Some cases, some grantees out there, they use CDBG just for the program delivery. And then for the hard costs, for the project costs, they use non-CDBG. Maybe they use redevelopment, maybe they use a local housing trust fund. In those cases, if you're spending CDBG but there's no other CDBG activities in the system to capture and report those accomplishment data, then you're going to answer no to this question, and you will in fact report program accomplishments under the program delivery activity. Okay, so that's scenario number 2. The third scenario is you use CDBG to pay for the program delivery of a program where home funds are used to pay for the hard costs. In that specific scenario, you can use 14J, which is housing services, another eligible, it's a distinct eligibility category under CDBG where you can use CDBG to pay for the program delivery of your home program. In that case, it's a little confusing because you're going to report accomplishments under home-funded activities, and you'll also need to report accomplishments under your CDBG-funded program delivery activity as well. And we've had a lot of questions about this, so if it's unclear at this point, I would really encourage you to look at that FAQ, because I know we're going to have a question on the FAQ that speaks to this, and hopefully we'll be able to outline a couple of these scenarios to make it really clear in terms of when you use this field right here and not report accomplishments, and when you do want to actually report accomplishments for that program delivery activity. It's a confusing aspect of the system, and we want to make sure that everybody gets it correct. Okay, I'm going to keep going on the slides. I see we're getting a lot of questions, and that's good. Keep them coming. I'm going to try to get through a few more of the slides. I want to make sure that we cover all the materials, and then I'll try to cover some of these questions towards the end. Okay, so the next slide talks about reporting, being complete in your reporting. And again, a lot of these fields that we see, I'm going to pull up maybe the accomplishment screen for this activity. We're going to see a lot of performance. Oops. We're going to see a lot of performance accomplishments, performance measures. Having some technical difficulties here, folks. Just bear with me. Get back into the system. There we are. And I'm going to pull up that Thompson Automotive again. And this time I'm going to go to the accomplishment screens. So depending on your national objective and matrix code and the type of activity you're doing, you're going to see some different performance measures. In this case, I'm seeing some additional performance measures for jobs. most performance measures you see are going to be on page 2 of your accomplishment detail up here. And again, these are going to change based on the matrix code you selected and the national objective, and a couple other indicators as well. So here I see a whole bunch of performance measures. In some cases, the system is going to double check to make sure you provide some data. In other cases, it's not, okay? So make sure that if they apply, go ahead and provide that data, because again, it's going to flesh out and tell a better story, a more complete story of the benefits that your communities are realizing due to CDBG. So if you see performance measures, the system may or may not make you put it in there. But you need, if it does apply, you need to be informed enough and understand the program enough that you should be collecting it and you should be providing it in the system. So HUD gets a nice complete data set of the actual beneficiaries in the system. Okay. Again, we saw a very good example of this is where the system cannot require data entry because something may be fully funded out of CDBG, but that 9 times out of 10, that's not the case. In the real world, you're using other funds. So you need to go back to that leveraging section and make sure that if your program is funded out of other funding sources, report that in IDIS, and it's going to make CDBG and your community specifically look better. Okay, so again, the performance measures are helping us tell a better, more complete story of the benefit that CDBG is providing to your community. Make sure that even if the system does not require that field, if it applies to the activity you're undertaking, go ahead and report the data in that field. Energy Star units. There's been some concern from HUD that people are actually over-reporting on this. So this is one of the things HUD is tracking very closely. In fiscal year 2010, grantees across the country reported 1,800 Energy Star units. After they actually called around to some of the grantees and verified this, they actually backed that number down to 369. And the problem here is HUD only wants you to count, or I shouldn't say the problem, but the issue is HUD only wants you to count units that are brought completely up to the Energy Star standard. I'm going to pull up a housing activity so we can see the specific field we're talking about. Let's take a look at a multifamily rehab. I'm going to go to the Edit Accomplishment section, and it should be on page 2 with my other performance measures. So this is the field I'm talking about right here, units qualified as Energy Star. And the manual actually has a very nice description of kind of the thresholds you have to meet to report a unit as qualifying as Energy Star. And one of those elements is that you actually get one of those home energy auditors out there to certify the entire unit, that the entire unit meets Energy Star standards. And they'll actually sign off on a piece of paper and say that, yes, this unit is Energy Star certified. So they're not talking about just putting in maybe energy efficient appliance or swapping out 1 or 2 windows or doors. They want the whole unit to be up to that standard. Your slide, if you downloaded them, does have this link to the materials, the same one I showed you earlier. I'm going to go ahead and click on it. And down in the training binder materials, you can click on that. That's just going to drop you down to the bottom of the page. But we see under guidance we have Energy Star performance standards for buildings. So that will actually, provide a lot of information in terms of when to count the unit as Energy Star and what that standard actually is. So if you have questions about when to count it and when not, use this guidance piece. And again, that's on the ComCon website. Okay. So another common problem that grantees have, and it's understandable given the nature of the program, is when you're underreporting on certain income categories when you're funding a presumed benefit activity. So let me get back to that screen real quick in the system. It should just be the last page. And so presumed benefit activities are usually public service or public facility activities. So we're talking about this income section here, and you can see the system wants you to break out the beneficiaries by extremely low, which is defined as 0 to 30% of area median income, low, which is 30 to 50, and moderate, which is 50 to 80. And in some cases, when you're helping the limited clientele, you might help people over 80%. So they want you to break that information out by these income levels. Okay? So with presumed benefit activities, grantees are not required to collect income data. They're not required to verify income data. So anytime you're serving one of these subpopulations, HUD says basically we can safely assume that at least 51% of these folks are going to be low mod, so we're not going to require you to do the paperwork to document that they are in fact low income. The problem is grantees have been doing these types of activities that exclusively serve these populations, but then they're reporting everybody as moderate income. They say, oh, well, we know moderate income is going to, fit the bill. It's going to show that we met the national objective. But that's really not the case. So what HUD has said is, they said, we've come up with some assumptions. So if you provide a public service that exclusively benefits abused children, for example, we want you to report everybody as extremely low income. If you serve battered spouses, report everybody as low income. So use this slide as your guidance. Don't automatically report everybody as moderate income. Instead, refer to this guidance here on this slide. It's also in your manual. I know under limited clientele activities, this is when it comes into play. So look in your manual. It may be on page 10.6. I'm kind of stretching the limitations of my memory there, but I know it's in the limited clientele chapter. So use this slide or look in your manual, and it will tell you which category to report under everybody. So if I serve 100 people, homeless persons under a program, I'm going to report all 100 under this extremely low income category. Okay, so again, HUD has not been getting credit, and you have not been getting credit for serving non-low mod people. And there's actually something in the statute that says you cannot design your programs that are going to benefit moderate income persons to the exclusion of low income persons. So this is one scenario where you definitely want to follow HUD's guidance in terms of reporting the data correctly. Otherwise, it's just not going to look good. So again, make sure that if you are using presumed benefit, don't just throw everybody under the moderate category. Go ahead and follow HUD's guidance. Report them under extremely low and low. Okay? And there's that slide again. Okay, so program income. HUD suspects there's been some significant underreporting of program income especially for state programs out there, where your subrecipient organizations or your partner organizations, they're allowed to retain that program income to undertake additional activities. Also in cases where funds are coming into a revolving loan fund and then going back out for additional loans, HUD feels that grantees are not always reporting on that new activity. The thing to remember here is when the subrecipients retain that program income, they're still CDBG funds. They're still held to that same standard of funds that come out of the Treasury. They're still CDBG funds. If they're used incorrectly, they still have to be repaid. And you also want to get benefit. You want to get credit for using these funds and actually generating these funds. It's going to make the program, and your program specifically, look better. So if you do have a program where your subrecipient is allowed to keep that program income, and then they carry out additional activities, you need to set up another activity in IDIS or basically use an existing activity in IDIS to capture the accomplishment for that additional funding. Okay, so if you have a program and the subrecipient, let's say you gave them $100,000 to rehab 10 houses, and then you allow them to recapture the repayment and do 5 more houses, you have to make sure that IDIS captures the data for those 5 additional houses. Okay, you can't just cut it off after the 10 the original 10 houses and not track that information in IDIS. You have to show that the funds went, the funds that were generated and held by the subrecipient went towards eligible activities, and you need to report on the accomplishments for those activities as well. So something to keep in mind. You may have an activity, if the subrecipient keeps spending that money over and over again over a span of 10 years, you could have, theoretically, an activity that's open for 10 years. And that's fine as long as you continue to report accomplishments and to continue to track that program. Okay, so in summary, you need to really take a look at IDIS both throughout the year and especially at the end of the year when you're preparing your CAPER to make sure that, again, you're meeting those 3 tests, that the data you're entering is timely, it's entered in a timely manner, you're complete in the sense that if a field does apply to the activity you're undertaking, that you're providing information for it in the system, and third, that it's accurate, okay? So you're using the right fields, like on that leverage funds, for example, you're not using Appalachian Regional Commission unless you get money from the Appalachian Regional Commission. We know that all the grantees out there are doing a good job. They're using this information, using these funds to really provide a benefit to the communities and especially the low-income people in those communities. However, that does not always get translated and captured by the system. So poor quality and incomplete data, it downplays the effect of the CDBG program. So we want to make sure that everybody across the country gets full credit for all the good work that they're doing. IDIS is more and more being used by the public HUD and Congress to basically measure the quality and the effect that the CDBG program is having. So we really want to make sure that IDIS is correctly capturing this data. And again, you can use at the local level when you're presenting this information to your public and to your decision makers, you can use IDIS data to assess the performance of your program and the effectiveness of your program. So, but that's only going to happen if the data is in the system. Okay, so I know a lot of you have been submitting a lot of questions throughout. I'm going to go ahead and pull up that question list here. And let me just give me a moment or two and I can find some good ones. I'm going to switch back to IDIS as well. Okay, and I might, just so we don't get kicked out again, I'm going to go back to the home page. Okay, so we have one question here. We can use CDBG to pay for rehab admin when we're using local funding for rehab, but then we report on accomplishments for the rehab admin activity. Yes, again, that's one of the important points we wanted to make, is if you are using CDBG just to pay for the program delivery of that rehab, you're not paying any CDBG for the project cost. In effect, you're just going to have one activity in IDIS. You're not going to have any activities to represent the project costs, right? So there's no other place other than the program delivery activity to report on those accomplishments. I mean, and when we're talking about this issue, just keep one general rule in mind: is if you spend CDBG dollars, CDBG accomplishments have to be reported somewhere in IDIS, preferably once. Okay, so if you don't have any activity in the system to represent the hard costs, the only activity you would have in IDIS is your program delivery activity. In that case, you would have to report the accomplishments under the program delivery activity. So I hope that answers your question. We have a question here. Would you please comment further on the unduplicated count of people for CDBG? So in the case of the soup kitchen, 200 people come in for meals 5 days a week. Of that number, we know from staff that 80 to 90% of those people are repeat clients almost every day. If we don't try to unduplicate, then this project would report 200 people times 365 days in a year, reporting 73,000 persons benefiting, as opposed to something much closer to the reality of 600 to 700 persons benefiting from the program. Yeah, so that's a very good example of the difference between reporting unduplicated, which would be those 600 people or 700 people who receive services, versus 73,000 essentially units of service. Okay, to come up with a simpler example, let's assume that you have a program that just serves one child in a child program, child care program. The unduplicated count, if you just helped one child, would be 1. But if that child receives service 365 days a year, the duplicated count would be 365. Okay, so now that we've distinguished between duplicated and unduplicated, HUD really would prefer to have unduplicated. Okay, so in some cases, such as the soup kitchen, you know, it may be somewhat of a guessing game, or you may have to implement some type of administrative control to say, okay, maybe you register to use the service the first time you use it, and then afterwards you don't. And again, I'm not telling you that's how it has to be, but I'm just trying to give you an example of something that may be able to help you come up with a better count. Okay. Another time where double counting can occur that we've seen is with economic development. Okay, so when you report on, let's say you create a job, and the first person to take that job is only hired for 3 months, and then for whatever reason they leave. They're either fired or maybe they go on to find another job. In IDIS, you're going to use the data, the race and ethnicity and income data for that first hire, and you only report that first hire once in the system. So if you hired Mary first, you report Mary in the system, and then 3 months later Mary is fired and you hire John, you're not going to report a second job in IDIS, and you're not going to, there's no need to erase Mary's data and put in John's data, okay? So only count a job the first time it's filled, and use that person's data when reporting on the job. You don't have to update that, okay? So very good questions. Keep them coming. Let me scroll through the list and see if I can come up with some more. It looks like we have another 30 minutes, I believe. Let's see. Okay, so one of the questions we have is, if you indicate that the accomplishments for one activity is reported in another activity, will you be able to close that activity without entering any statistical information? Very good question, and the answer is yes. If you go back to that activity, I mean, that's really the function of this question, is, again, HUD wants accomplishment data for each activity that spends money, right? The one example, or the one case where you don't have to do that, well, two, is one is admin, because you don't have to report on accomplishments for admin. The second is, and actually I went to the wrong screen, I want to go back to setup. If I go to setup, and again I just want to point out where we are. Okay, again, we're talking about this field right here, associate to another activity. If I answer yes to this question and report on an activity number, the system should let me complete this activity without providing accomplishment data. Okay, that's the whole point of this field. So yeah, that's a good question. If you answer yes to this, you should not have to provide accomplishment data. You may want to provide a narrative, because this activity will show up on your GPR. You may want to provide a narrative to explain how this activity is related to those other activities, but you won't have to report on numeric accomplishments. Okay, here's another question. A single-family rehab project expected to complete 10 homes during the 2010 program year. Due to a slow start, only 5 were completed. The sub-grantee, the person carrying out the activity, received an extension to complete the activity in 2011. The project was not reported in 2010, but will be reported in 2011. Do I wait till 2011 to report 10 homes in IDIS, or report 5 in 2010 and 5 in 2011? Should I wait for the CAPER also or split accomplishments? Again, this is a good question, and anytime you're coming in and doing a data cleanup, it raises a lot of issues. This is one case where you may have missed the window in terms of getting credit for that 2010, for the 5 units done in 2010. If they weren't reported at all in 2010, you may work with your local HUD representative and maybe report all 10 in 2011. This is a good question, and I'm actually going to punt on this one. Let me discuss this a little bit more with some of the HUD folks, and we'll post this up into the FAQ, because I think this is a good question, and a lot of grantees out there, especially if you've encountered some staff turnover, you may be playing catch-up and not know where to report on these units. So I'm going to punt on this one and ask and get back to this one on the FAQ. Okay. One quick question, should I go back and correct presumed benefit data mistakes from 2009? So maybe a grantee put everything under moderate income in 2009. HUD is saying, no, there's no need to do that. Basically, 2009, in terms of their books, they're closed, and they're going to be looking at 2010 and 2011. So really no need to go back and do 2009. Actually, there is one other issue that HUD asked me to address, and I haven't got to it yet. So this is a good time to talk about it. It's come to HUD's attention that there's a lot of canceled activities out there, especially going back to 2001. That's what they're interested right now in. So any canceled activities from 2001 forward, we're not talking about activities that maybe were carried forward into the system as part of the initial load of data, way back in 1997. They're looking at 2001 forward, cancel activities that have drawdowns. Okay, so technically, any activity in IDIS that has drawdowns, if it met a national objective, you would report on all of the accomplishments, and then you would mark that activity as complete. But what HUD has found is there's a large number of activities in there that are basically have drawdowns and are marked as canceled. And the reason you're able to do that in the system is because there are some cases, mostly with economic development, where you spend the money, and just because the business went out of business and was not able to actually create the jobs, you can cancel that activity without reporting accomplishment. However, that should be the exception rather than the rule. So we're going to use this webinar to kind of give you a heads up. Anybody out there who's listening, what we wanted you to do is maybe go in, take a look at some reports. The PRO2 would be a good example where you could quickly go in and look at, find some of these activities that are canceled that also have draws. Actually, the PRO2, now that I think about it, may not be a good example because I don't know if canceled activities can be listed on that. But just be aware that in the next 2 weeks, HUD's going to be making some phone calls, calling out to some grantees that have a large number of these activities, again, that are canceled withdrawals, and they're going to be asking you some questions. So try in the future, try to avoid that. If you do have any activities that you do have to cancel that already have draws, and in a large number of these cases, these are cases where you're going to have to repay those funds. You can talk to your field office to get guidance on that. So I just wanted you to be aware that this is an initiative that HUD is closely looking at in the next couple of weeks. If you do have a large number of activities or any activities that are canceled withdrawals, if you haven't already done so, maybe take the time and maybe you can preempt some of the issues by using that narrative section of the accomplishment field and reporting what exactly happened with that activity, if funds were repaid, how that was handled as well. Okay, so we will take a look at that. And again, if you do have any of those activities, you may be getting a call in the next couple weeks from HUD. Okay, moving on. Any chance that we might ever see an activity matrix code specifically for economic development loan programs? Actually, there are some matrix codes out there already, and the ones that are available to you right now, I'm going to go back to the first page. They're pretty extensive, and they should be able to serve any type of program you're doing. All the economic development matrix codes they start basically with 17, And anything under the 17 series, basically by selecting a matrix code with 17, you're indicating that the grantee or a nonprofit is carrying out the activity, or maybe potentially another government entity. And then the 18 series, 18A, B, and C, are where the funds are going directly to a for-profit. So those should serve your needs. If you do have a specific program design where you think those codes aren't working for you, I would encourage you to talk it out with your HUD representative. And if between you and your HUD representative you can't come up to a consensus in terms of which code to use, go ahead and send in another question, maybe to myself or Karen Pierce, or if you know kind of the details already, you can submit it to the question here, and maybe we'll get something up in the FAQ. I know HUD does have the capability of adding new matrix codes to the system, but you know, at the present moment, I believe they're pretty happy with the list. Okay, let's see. How do I set up an activity to pay for lead testing, or is that part of the rehab activity? That's a very good question. If you have a distinctive program where somebody can apply just for the lead testing and you're not doing anything else, it's not, you know, a smaller component of a larger program, I would say, yeah, you might want to set that up as a separate activity. However, if the lead testing is just a component of the overall rehab program, and anytime you do rehab, you have to do some element of lead safety, that would be rolled into the overall rehab activity. There's no need to set up a separate activity for the lead costs, okay? But very good question. If you need further clarification on that, go ahead and submit a follow-up question. Let me keep going through the list here. Okay, one concern that grantees had is when you begin to enter multiple addresses for low-mod housing activities, the system is getting slower the more addresses you enter. And HUD has indicated that HUD is aware of this, and they're aware of this, and they're working on and making improvements to this feature. For the time being, if your program is doing just very light rehab where you're serving a whole slew of houses, like for example a tool lending library, maybe you're serving, you know, hundreds and hundreds of activities, or you're doing graffiti removal but on specific owner-occupied properties, you know, which would actually qualify not as a public service but as a housing rehab. HUD says you don't have to put in the individual addresses for these types of really minor repairs. So maybe you're putting in new locks or smoke detectors, or you're operating the tool lending library or paint programs. HUD has indicated that you do not have to provide the individual addresses for these types of programs. Anytime you're going over and above that very minor repair work, yeah, that's when they want the addresses. So keep that in mind if you're one of those grantees who has one of those programs and you're concerned about entering, you know, hundreds and hundreds of addresses. One question is, will there be an 05 matrix code for homeless services? Right now, 03T is the correct code to use. I don't know if HUD's going to make that change to switch it from 03T to something in the 5 series, but for now, if you are doing homeless services, the correct code to be using would be 03T as opposed to something in the 05 series. And be aware that the system's smart enough that it knows that even though it's an 03 matrix code, when you do your PR26, when it's calculating your public service matrix, obligation, it includes 03T into that calculation. We have one grantee that is a county, and when they set up their housing rehab activity, they don't know the specific addresses yet, so they just put in county-wide. We had this issue, we had this specific question come up in last week's webinar. And I think one good way to do this is if you're just setting up your activity, a lot of it's going to depend on timing, but a lot of grantees, as soon as they get their grant, as soon as their action plan starts, they're going to set up an activity to represent the rehab program, and they don't yet have any specific addresses. Maybe they haven't started their application round, maybe they just don't have that information. What you can do is, go ahead and put in countywide or something generic, and then once you do get that first address, that first specific address of a rehab you're undertaking, go ahead and just write over. Don't add a new address, just write over where it says countywide and put in that first address, and that should work for you. Okay, so and then otherwise, basically, the rest of the addresses you can enter. I would encourage you to enter throughout the rest of the program year. Don't wait, especially now that this may be a large data entry task. Don't wait until the end of the year to enter all those addresses. Go ahead and try to enter those as you get them throughout the program year. There's no requirement right now. As long as you provide one address, the system will let you continue to set up the activity and fund it. You don't have to enter all of the addresses before you fund the activity. Okay, a couple more. Sometimes clients are assisted with housing counseling in one program year and financial assistance in another program year. If a grantee uses a subrecipient to provide housing counseling and then the grantee offers program assistance to the client, is it appropriate to identify the client both under 05U, which gives credit for the subrecipient activity, and 13, which gives credit to the grantee activity? Yeah, in this case, the housing counseling and the down payment assistance is really two separate programs. So in that case, you would have two separate activities, one coded as 05U for the counseling aspect undertaken by the subrecipient, and another activity for 13 for the down payment assistance. So very good question. In that case, you would have two activities with different matrix codes, and you would report that same person under both activities. Good question. Okay, what happens when in an address segment, i.e. the 500 block of Main Street, cannot be validated when you are ready to close out the project? Does HUD mind when these sites cannot be mapped in these instances? And, you know, HUD is basically going with whatever they can get. So in some cases, if I put in, you know, the 500 block to the 900 block of Main Street and the system cannot map it, HUD's going to be understanding there. But anytime it can map to a specific address, such as you know, a facility that's providing a service or a building that you're rehabbing, yes, go ahead and use that specific address, and hopefully HUD will be able to map it. But in the cases where you can't map it, you can never validate it, it's okay that you should be able to close it out. The system should allow you to close it out even though it was never able to validate that address. Okay, let's keep going. For multifamily rehab addresses, do you want us to add the addresses of the buildings, or do you want the building address plus individual apartment units? Very good question. In this case, HUD is just looking for the complex or the address. It's not looking for the individual units. So if you do a 500 unit, or let's just say a 10 unit building where you're rehabbing all 10 units in a building, you don't really need to use that multiple address feature. You would just enter the address of the building once. You don't have to add an address for each unit. Okay, so very good question. We've gotten this a couple times already with the housing webinar we did yesterday, or I'm sorry, last week. So there'll probably be some further clarification in the FAQ, but they're really just looking for that property address so they can map. You would report all of the units, of course, under the accomplishment section, but in terms of the address, they just need it once. Here's an issue that grantees have discovered after adding that multiple address feature. We discovered that upon entering multiple addresses for a project, it inadvertently multiplied the reported number of participants in grant amount by the number of addresses entered. As a result, the statistics on the PR03 report were incorrect. And there's also been instances of miscalculation on the PR26, the financial summary, if I'm correct. again, HUD is aware of this problem. They're working on it. They're going to get it hopefully addressed in an emergency release. But until then, and it looks like the emergency release will come out at the end of the month. So until then, HUD is aware of it, and there's really nothing we can do until they get that added to the system. All right, I think I have time for about one more question. Let me see if I can get a good one here. Okay, here's a good one referring to leveraging funds. If our local mental health program gets $20,000 of CDBG, but they get $400,000 from other sources, but it's for other programs, but part of what they want the whole nonprofit numbers. So basically, this is a really good question, and I'm glad this came up. So let's say the mental health department or the subrecipient, they do 5 different programs, but you're providing CDBG just for one of those programs. When it comes to entering that leveraging data, just enter data, not for the whole nonprofit organization, but just for that program they're funding. So maybe you're funding the staff portion and you're putting in $20,000 to $30,000, and they're going to provide, the space, and they're going to provide money for supplies and for outreach. So they would take a prorated cost of the space they're providing. And so, yeah, very good question. You're just going to be entering data for what they're contributing in terms of for that program as opposed to their entire budget. That sounds like a very good candidate for the FAQ, so I wouldn't be surprised if we took that and expanded upon that in the FAQ, and you should see that posted to the ComCom website. Let me see if I can get one more in. Looks like we have about a few more minutes here. Okay, here's a question. We have a public service activity that we fund every year. They do not save the same people every year, but they offer the same service every year. Do we keep the same activity every year or create a new activity? In that specific question, and a lot of grantees have this, the same scenario, what I typically do is I set up activities to represent the funding agreement that I have with that public service agency. So if you're entering into a new funding agreement for that public service agency, one way to do it would be to have the IDIS activity represent the funding agreement. And if that agreement has a term of 1 year and it closes out at the end of that year, you would then report on the accomplishments, draw down all the money that they spent, and close out that activity. And then if they have another funding agreement in the new year, you would set up a new IDIS activity to represent that. However, with that said, I know some grantees out there, and in terms of affecting your reporting ability, you could have one activity, just increase the funding, extend the existing agreement, and just use that, insert a new accomplishment year to report on multiple years for that one program. So that's one option you do have, but go ahead and maybe work with your CPD rep, because one element of this is to make sure that IDIS reflects and kind of mimics what's in your action plan. So, if your CPD rep sees something in your action plan for 2011, but the activity you're funding, you're just increasing funding for a 2009 activity, for example, you're just going to have to help your CPD representative make that leap to look under that 2009 activity for all that benefit, even though it was funded as a new activity in 2011. So kind of keep that in mind. So I think that's all the time we have for questions. Let me get through just one or two more slides here, and then we'll call it a day. And again, if I did not get to your questions, don't worry. We have this whole questions log where we're recording all of the questions asked, and we have your email associated with that. So if I didn't get a chance to answer your question during the webinar, please, we'll either follow up with an email, or we may just post it to an FAQ to that DRGR. So please be patient with us. Be aware that there's several hundred people on this call, and it may take a few days for us to get to every single question. Okay. So just before we end, I want to point out some additional resources. Again, we're gonna have a web-based version of the 2-day live training, and it's going to be posted to that ComCon website. What it's going to do is it's going to be a video of a GoToWebinar, actually, where we walk through the slides the same slides we walked through in the training, and then actually a video walkthrough step-by-step of how to set up and complete each type of IDIS activity. CDBG, of course, not home. There's 3 other webinars in this IDIS in 90-minute series. 2 we did last week. One was on housing specifically, and the second one was on public facilities, public services, and economic development. Both of those are now posted to that ComCon website. So again, if you go to this website, you should see recordings of these 2 webinars. Today's webinar will also be posted. It usually takes maybe 3 or 4 days to get it posted up there. So just be patient. If you have a colleague who wanted to see this and they weren't able to catch it, just be aware that it should be posted to that same website in 3 to 4 days. And then tomorrow we have our final webinar in the series called Generating CDBG Reports in IDIS. It's going to start at about 12:30 Eastern Standard Time, or Eastern Daylight Time. Let me see. Couple more things. One more thing is an online evaluation will automatically be sent to each person signed up for this webinar. You should be seeing that pop up in your inbox in about 1 hour. So please take a few moments to complete the evaluation. You know, a lot of people, we've gotten a lot of positive feedback on these webinars that allows you to watch them from your office and not have to travel, which is a nice thing. Everybody's short on dollars these days. So, but we're always looking to improve. So whether it's a technical issue that you had with sound quality or video quality, or just any type of feedback you want to provide to us all, go ahead and please do that evaluation. And we want to make sure that these webinars meet all of your needs. So with that, I want to say thank you for attending today's webinar. The information we presented, we feel is very important, and we want to make sure that everybody, again, is using IDIS to provide good quality data to highlight all the benefits that are happening in your community and around the country. So thank you, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it was beneficial.